Marked by Murder. Written by S. Thomas Thompson. Narrated by Christian Neal. Chapter 1. "Another one of those days," Electra said, staring at the wall. Washington was going through somewhat of a famine as far as killings were concerned. She should be happy. People were able to sleep easily in their beds. Kids played out late at night without the fear that there was a killer on the loose. Vulnerable people could sleep without having to leave one eye open. The world was a better place. And Electra was grateful for that. But what she wasn't grateful for was the potential that the team was whittled down further. Over the past few years, as crime dropped, the team had gone from more than 10 to just a handful. Her, Augustine, Ash, and Alice. Gary was behind bars. Lou had stepped aside. She liked being part of something bigger. Reducing this team down to 1 or 2 wasn't what she was all about. If one more detective left, then she would consider going to another station, a bigger one, where there were more people. Electra didn't like being lonely. This played its way out in her love life. She bounced from one relationship to another, none of them really giving her the feeling that it was going anywhere fast, if anywhere at all. The latest was a guy who called himself Star, like it was something to be proud of. His real name was Stuart Arthur, so he mingled, or was that mangled, the first 2 letters of each name and came up with the moniker Star. He called himself it, introduced himself as it, and even looked into the possibility of changing his name by deed poll to it permanently. Electra liked spending time with him in the first few weeks, even months. But after that, he got on her nerves. Her tolerance levels for anything other than a competent man who didn't need picking up off the floor every 5 minutes was pretty much 0. Star shone brightly when he was in the company of others, but when he and Electra were on their own, he sank into a depression of no self-confidence. She wasn't willing to be the one who picked him up and dusted him off time after time. She had enough on her own plate. And so they were going through the final throes of a relationship. "And the other days won't be far behind," Augustine responded. He knew, and he knew she knew. It was just that we all need reminding of things every now and again. "I'm almost caught up with everything," Electra replied, and that was most unlike her. She had a reputation for not answering messages unless they were vitally important. It did mean that she didn't get nearly as many unimportant messages as the rest of them, but it also meant that she was out of the loop on many things to do with the team and the police force in general. The phone rang on her desk. She tried to remember the last time it had rang before picking it up. "Electra, murder team," she answered. Augustine sat forward. Yes, no, I haven't been involved in an accident. I don't think you should be calling this number with sales calls. Please take this number off your mailing list," she answered. Augustine sat back in his chair. The next half an hour was spent looking out of the window, answering the odd email and uttering sentences in very much the same vein as "another one of those days." Chapter 2. On the other side of town at the George Washington Golf Club, something was in play that would break the boredom for Electra. She just didn't know it yet. "Fore!" he shouted. It was a shout more of frustration than of warning others of the impending danger of a golf ball. In fact, they were the only 2 people still on the course. He had been playing the worst round of his life. This was made even more frustrating because he was playing against an old school friend that he desperately wanted to beat. Johnny Lawton was the kid all the other kids wanted to be. He was the school captain for pretty much every sports team except for rugby. That was a game that he didn't understand. Then, in the intervening years, he rested on his laurels and found that everyone else had overtaken him. He wasn't the best footballer, the fastest runner, or the basketball player most likely to play at a high standard. Everyone else around him had kept on keeping on. The guy he was playing, Mark McManus, was a kid who wasn't very good at anything sporty at school. Not the worst, but nowhere near the best. Slightly above average. but now McManus was wiping the floor with him. McManus had been in touch via Facebook and asked if he wanted a game of golf. Johnny accepted another chance to assert his dominance over the kids from school. McManus played every week, went to the driving range, and took occasional lessons with the pro. In short, he got better all the time. Johnny Lawton didn't. He had a knack for the game, part of his sporting prowess, he guessed, and just laid back on that. He played when he was challenged, didn't practice, and assumed he would be good forever. He wasn't. "I'm enjoying this," Mark stated, looking for a reaction from a guy he looked up to at school, but felt that he was always being looked down upon. Johnny mumbled an obscenity under his breath. He hoped that Mark would get the message. The rest of the game was played in almost silence. The friction was evident in the air. Nobody else was on the course to relieve the tension with their presence. The game finished with a 15-stroke victory for Mark McManus. As they finished, both men bypassed the closed clubhouse and went straight to the car park. Johnny wished that the ground would swallow him whole. At least it was over, he told himself. The handshake at the end of the round almost killed him. All he wanted to do was walk away to opposite ends of the car park and get on with his life. As it happened, they were parked right next to each other, at the far end, the deserted part of the car park. "I think we should do that again," Mark said as he lifted his bag of clubs into the boot. "Not on your life," Johnny replied. "Not a sore loser, are we, Johnny? Now you know how everyone else felt when they played against you as a kid," Mark responded, not noticing that Johnny was closing in on him. Half a second later, Johnny had him by the neck. He was a far bigger man, lifting Mark off the ground with his size and strength. "Let go!" Mark croaked with all the wind he could muster through his vocal cords. Johnny punched him in the stomach with his free hand before dropping Mark to the ground. He followed that up with a frenzy of kicks and punches that took the breath from the smaller man. "Oh, fuck you!" Mark groaned. Another kick to the ribs and a "fuck you" back from Johnny, and the exchange was finished. Johnny knew he had the strength to kill a man if he wanted. He revved up his BMW, looked in disdain at the smaller Vauxhall driven by his former alumnus, and drove off at speed. Chapter 3. Electra got up from the sofa. She had decided this was the best place to sleep. She didn't want an argument, really didn't want his wandering hands on her body, and just needed a good sleep. The TV was still on from the night before. She had changed the setting once, so it didn't automatically switch off after a period of inactivity, and hadn't worked out how to change it back. She reached for the remote and found that it had dropped into the deepest recesses between the cushions. It was a second-hand sofa that had stood her in good stead. The last thing she wanted to do was reach through decades of detritus to recover the remote. But she didn't feel like she had a great deal of choice in the matter. Electra held her breath, like that would protect her from the flotsam and jetsam she was passing with her hand. Something slimy went across the back of her hand. It felt like a dropped jelly sweet. She winced, but still held on to that breath, finally feeling the familiar plastic casing of the TV remote. When it was back on the surface of the sofa, Electra pushed the on-off button and sank back into her sleeping position. She would get another half an hour. By that time, he would probably be out of the building and on his way to work. She could then have the run of the place to herself. As Electra tried her way of getting back to sleep, her phone buzzed. She was imagining fireworks, each containing a 2-digit number. They would go off slowly and without sound, helping her drift off to sleep with the monotony of it all. She tossed an imaginary coin in her head to decide whether to answer the call. Heads would mean she answered it. Tails, she would ignore the call and continue her attempt to get another half an hour of sleep to set her up for the day. It was heads. "Hey," she answered in a half-voice, half-whisper. "Electra, we need you at the George Washington Golf Club as soon as possible." "Okay, Gus. Give me 15 minutes. Chapter 4. Around 10 minutes before Electra was stirring on the sofa, something else was stirring in the car park of the golf course. The car park was never locked, and it wasn't unusual for cars to be left there overnight. If golfers had a few drinks, then they would get a taxi or Uber home and work out retrieving their car the next day when they were sober. Amelia Catrone was about to start her shift in the Orangery restaurant, serving breakfasts to hungry golfers. She always got there early and always parked her 53-plate Nissan Micra in the far reaches of the car park. She was told on her induction to the business that the spaces nearest the entrance should be saved for guests. The staff were to park as far away as possible. Amelia did this even though she knew she was the only one that did. On arriving and parking next to a Vauxhall Vectra, she noticed someone on the ground next to it. The next thing Amelia saw was a trail of blood from the body to the rear driver's side tyre. Everything else was a blur as she walked away from the scene, called an ambulance, and was told that the police were on their way too. And then she sat down. There would be no breakfast, no golfers, and for Amelia, no anything for the rest of the day. She needed to get that image out of her head. She sat in her Micra, waiting for the ambulance and police to arrive. The person on the other end of the phone had asked her if she was sure that the person was dead. Amelia lied and stated that she had checked the pulse, but it wasn't the pulse that indicated death. She could feel it in the air. It stagnated, making her choke. Death was something that hung in the atmosphere as far as Amelia was concerned, and this atmosphere was completely full of a lack of life. She breathed it in with every gulp. She saw darkness surround the body and the car that it was laid next to. Amelia heard the sirens and got back out of her car. She waved her arms when the ambulance arrived. She knew the wait was over. Chapter 5. "What have we here?" Electra asked. She and Augustine were in separate cars, both a couple of minutes behind the ambulance. They were afforded a 10-second look at the body as it was being wheeled onto the ambulance. There were no signs of life. The man would be taken to the hospital, but there was no chance of him surviving. It was probably strangulation, the paramedic explained, plus a beating. And then the ambulance was gone. "Thoughts?" Augustine asked, when the flashing light on top of the ambulance had gone out of their view. "Death," was the answer. But it wasn't from Electra. It was from someone who stood up from behind the car that belonged to Mark McManus. She was looking at the outline of blood that had made its way around the edge of the body, as though it was a chalk outline from a dated movie. "And you are?" Electra asked. "My name is Amelia Catrone. I called for you guys and the ambulance when I found him. I knew there was nothing the paramedics could do for him, but I assume there is a great deal you can do. I want you to bring his killer to justice." "That's kind of our job, Amelia. What did you see?" Augustine asked, moving so he stood next to Electra. "I saw almost nothing. I got out of my car," she explained, pointing at her vehicle, "and then I saw a pair of legs on the ground. Apart from calling 999, that's as much as I saw, and I didn't want to see anything else. I already know that those legs, that blood, will haunt me in my dreams. I don't suppose you understand what that's like." "Unfortunately, I know only too well," Augustine replied. The bodies of unsolved murder victims had haunted him in his dreams for years, but he was more interested in the dreams of the young girl stood opposite. "Oh, like hell you do." "I can't persuade you, but I have similar dreams. What brings about yours?" Augustine asked. "Past memories. Care to elaborate?" he prompted. "Is this official?" Amelia asked. "Like what?" "Part of the murder investigation?" "No, but we are here to help you," Augustine explained. "Well, as long as this isn't written down anywhere, I don't mind answering." "Well," Electra responded, "we will need to take a statement about what you saw, but this won't be part of it." "In that case, I don't mind." My brother died when I was 16. I found his body at the end of the garden. He had been missing for a few days. We were frantic with worry. I remember my parents spending all day and night looking for him. We had a long garden, with a couple of sheds at the bottom. We had never spent any time in the garden before, so we didn't think to look there. As it happened, he got trapped between the shed and the tree next to it in a storm. A branch fell off and hit him on the head. He visits me in my dreams all the time. Sometimes it's calming and reassuring. Other times he's got his head bashed in and he chases after me. I don't want this guy to be in my dreams. If you catch his killer, then I'm sure he won't. Amelia, our job is to catch killers. That's all we do. So we're going to do all we can to bring the killer of this guy to justice. Do you hear me? Augustine explained with the most reassuring voice he could muster. Thank you. Now can I give my statement so I can go home? Of course you can. Chapter 6. Johnny Lawton got up with a feeling of deep regret surrounding him. He didn't like these days, the ones where he flinched when he thought about some of his actions the day before. But they weren't really like he was carrying those actions out. It was like he was a spectator. It was like he was having an out-of-body experience. Johnny sighed when he thought of the last few blows he delivered to Mark McManus. He couldn't let it lie at just a few punches. He had to take it to the next level. That was how Johnny had lost his last job. It was a work night out. Johnny hadn't drunk, but Peter Lever had far more than he could handle and had started harassing Johnny. He told Johnny that he was a better salesman. Johnny shrugged. He was more than happy with his performance and the bonus that went with it. But when he told Johnny that he was better in bed, a fact confirmed by Jenny from accounts, Johnny couldn't help himself. He gave Peter a punch to the side of the jaw. That should have been it. As far as Peter was concerned, that was it. He wasn't going to mention anything else. He was preparing to walk away. But before Peter's legs could carry him away from the angry colleague, Johnny had landed another punch, then another, and another. Peter had a broken jaw. Johnny had his P45. It took him some time working his way back up to get anything like the same salary and perks. This time, he didn't work with Mark McManus, but he'd done it while he was using the firm's pass to the golf course. Johnny thought about getting away for a while. He had a stack of annual leave that he'd carried over from the previous year, in addition to the 0 he'd already taken that financial year. He could disappear for a while, let things blow over and come back as though nothing had happened. That was the way things worked in his head. For Johnny Lawton, things just blew over. It all turned out right in the end. At least, that's what his mother told him. She was the font of all knowledge when Johnny was young. Not that she was especially knowledgeable, just that she was all he had. Her parents had died before he was born. He had no siblings, and his father vanished, along with any communication from his family. Johnny's mam was on her own, so he listened to what she had to say and took it as gospel. Any anger that he felt with the world came from outside the family home. She wasn't angry. In fact, she was the least angry person Johnny had ever met. She looked upon him as a blessing and ignored all of the other things that happened to them. Her parents passed on enough before they passed away. If Johnny's father didn't want to be around, then so be it. Johnny was angry enough for both of them. He shouted at passing dogs that barked, encouraging them to bark more. And he shouted more. Other kids learned to steer clear of Johnny. At first, it was just when he got angry, but then his short fuse meant that his outbursts became more frequent. So, kids stayed away from him all the time, which made him even angrier. By the time he left school, he pretty much had nobody he could call a friend. All he had left was his mother, and she was gone before he hit 20. More anger. But Johnny told himself that anger was the answer rather than the problem. He lucked out more often than not, so told himself that anger wasn't the problem. Time to get away from it all. He would jump in the car and drive to an obscure part of Scotland. Johnny had heard that you could just pull your car up on the side of the road and sleep there in Scotland. So, that's what he would do. Time away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. Time for the fuss surrounding Mark McManus to subside. Time for Johnny to sit and think about life. And he needed time. Chapter 7. Apart from the body, did you see anything unusual? Electra asked. Her and Amelia were sat in Electra's car at the opposite end of the car park to where she found the body. At the other end of the car park there was a flurry of activity from the forensic team. Tents had been erected, roadblocks were in place, and residents of the hotel were being escorted to their cars and out of the vicinity. That's not unusual enough, Amelia replied, pointing at the scene. Of course, but we're looking into anything else that might lead us to a murderer. Was the rest of the car park as you might expect to find it? Were there any other people there at that time? You know, that kind of thing. I don't think so. Let me dig into my memory banks, Amelia replied, closing her eyes, the eyelids flickering as she tried to recall the morning. Amelia had something akin to a photographic memory. She needed a little time to go back and replay the images in her head, but she could recall anything that happened in the previous few hours. It was like a small storage device in her head, but one that only had a certain amount of memory, wiping itself clean every few hours to make space for the next set of images. Nothing. Wait, maybe. Electra sat patiently while Amelia accessed her memories. She had seen people work like this before, so it wasn't a complete shock. But the people Electra had dealt with in the past were either other detectives or memory champions. She hadn't met someone who just worked at a regular job, who had this level of deep perception and recall. I think there was a bottle of beer laid on the curb between my car and where I found the man. Is he still a man now he's dead, or should I call him a body? She asked. Whatever works for you, Electra responded. What do you call it? A body, but we're clinical in what we do. Just work with whatever terms work for you. If I'm not sure, then I'll ask for more detail or clarity. So why would a beer bottle be significant? Electra inquired. Well, the cleaners come through here first thing in the morning. The car park is spotless before people turn up for the day. I don't know exactly what time, but I guess that they're here before 5:30. So there's never any rubbish here, especially beer bottles from the night before. Might the cleaners have missed something? Unlikely. I've never seen it before. We joke with the golfers that they can eat their breakfast off the tarmac in the car park. Late? Nope. The beer bottle was the only thing left behind. Let me make a call to forensics. I need to make sure that they check that bottle out. There could be some vital clues there. Electra made the call to Ian Mallon, the head of the forensics department. It wasn't a call anyone wanted to make. Mallon had a reputation for taking up a huge chunk of your time. He could talk for England, and none of it was particularly interesting. When she finished with Mallon, Electra completed all of the paperwork with Amelia Catrone. Their next point of call was to go inside the clubhouse and speak to someone about Mark's involvement with the club. Little did Electra and Augustine know that they were about to meet someone who displayed nothing but contempt for the police. Chapter 8. Can I ask you a few questions? Augustine asked as they stepped inside the clubhouse for the golf course. The man behind the counter was more interested in cleaning tufts of grass off the bottom of his shoes than dealing with customers. Only if you've got £45 an hour, he replied, not looking up from his feet, not giving Augustine and Electra the time of day. Augustine waited. When the man had finished picking at his shoes and throwing the remnants in the bin, he got up and walked away. "Excuse me," Augustine shouted after him. "You'll have to book an appointment," he responded, as he walked to the door at the back of the reception area. He was leaving, but before he did, a hand grabbed his arm and pulled him back. He turned to brush the hand away. That was when he noticed that a shock of blonde hair and some piercing eyes accompanied the hand. "Well, well, who do we have here?" he asked, slicking back his hair and trying to look into her eyes. Electra was having none of it. "Detectives Boyle and King," Electra replied, pointing to her colleague and then herself. "Yeah, right. Why would there be detectives in here?" "Maybe the body that was found in the car park earlier? Didn't you see the police presence, the ambulance?" Electra asked. "No, I'm a busy man. What do you want?" "Well, I suspect you won't be busy for a while, seeing as we've shut the place down. There will be nobody coming in or out, so you'll have plenty of time to talk to us." "Ugh, all right. Same question. What do you want?" "Firstly, I'd like a bit of courtesy. It costs nothing." "If it costs nothing, then it's worth nothing. I'm getting sick of asking the same question. Can we cut to the chase? If the course is closed, then I'm not needed here. If I'm not needed here, then there are better things I could be doing with my time. So, what do you want?" "Mark McManus was playing here yesterday. Who was he playing with?" "Is he the guy who was found in the car park then?" "Let's cut to the chase, shall we? The sooner you answer me, the sooner you can get on with your day. Who was he playing with?" Electra fought fire with fire. She wasn't about to be sidetracked by a guy with a bad attitude. "Oh, touché. I'll have a look on the computer system. By the way, do you have a warrant for this information?" Before Electra could reply, he backed out. "Sorry, I just couldn't help myself. I know you have probable cause, or whatever they call it. I'll look it up now. The system knows it's early in the morning. Just be a few seconds. Here we go. The name is Johnny Lawton. They were the last pair out. It must have been dark by the time they finished. I can give you his address if you want." "Yes, that would be helpful," Electra responded. "What's it worth? My name is Daniel, by the way, but my friends call me Dan." "Daniel, I wouldn't go there if I were you. It's worth not pissing me off. It's worth letting me get out of here. It's worth you getting on with your day. It's worth 1,000 things. But none of them involve you and me. Do I make myself clear?" Electra explained. Daniel nodded with every sentence. They got the details and prepared to get out of there. Before they did, Electra had 2 more questions, knowing that they might lead on to many more. "What time did you get here?" "What?" "Simple question, Daniel. What time did you get here?" "About 15 minutes ago." "Did you drive?" "Walked. I'm a bit of a fitness freak, you know." "And who runs this place?" "When it's not me?" "Yes, Daniel, when it's not you." "The general manager is a woman called Joyce Mccarty. I can tell her you called if you like." "No, you can give me her number and I'll make that call myself. I'm assuming you have CCTV here?" "Yes." "And it covers the car park?" "Some of it, yeah." "I'll get in touch with Joyce this morning and arrange to meet her here. Don't worry about your precious time. I'll take care of it from here." As they walked back to the car, Augustine turned his head towards Electra. "Bit harsh back there? Are you okay?" "Relationship troubles, Gus. And don't ask me anything else. That's all I'm willing to say on the matter." "Well, you know you'll have at least one officer when you're back on the market," Augustine joked, nodding his head back and towards the clubhouse of the golf club. "I like an older man, but he's 20 years older. Anyways, if you're so interested, then why don't you ask him out?" "For you? We're not back at school." Tension de-escalated. They got in the police car and headed over to the address they were given for Johnny Lawton. As they did, Daniel was pressing buttons on a CCTV system that he'd never been bothered to pay interest in before. Chapter 9. "What's he doing?" Electra asked as they arrived at the given address. There was a man there who fitted details they had on Johnny Lawton, which was just his date of birth, thus his age. He was supposed to be mid-40s and looked the part. His faded jeans were something he would have worn in his late teens. The checkered shirt and Wayfarer sunglasses completed the look of a man who thought Tom Cruise in Top Gun was the perfect depiction of a man in his prime. He had held on to his hair much better than Augustine. The blonde locks flicked back every time he added something to the boot of his car. Let's watch for a few moments. It would be interesting to see what he's packing. Looks like he's going away for a while. Augustine and Electra sat in their car opposite Lawton's home and examined him going backwards and forwards. He first went into the house and came out with a giant suitcase, the kind that you used to see all the time before budget airlines and restrictions in overhead lockers meant a trend to smaller and smaller cases that cost you nothing to take on holiday with you. Then the man they assumed was Johnny Lawton went to the garage and came out with a camping kit, small tent, stove, chair, blow-up bed, and a bag of other items. The realization that they didn't know for sure who the man was hit both of them at the same time. "Shall we go and see him?" they asked each other in unison. "Yes," they replied at the same time again. As they looked left and right before crossing the road, the pair of detectives assumed roles. Augustine was going to ask the questions this time. Electra took her pen and pad from her jacket pocket and prepared to make notes. "Johnny Lawton?" Augustine asked, flashing his badge in the same way he'd seen in the movies. It was awkward, but he needed to establish authority immediately. He'd seen the arrogance of one man so far that morning and wasn't willing to give another the chance to repeat. "Yes." There was no point in denying it. His registration plate said J20HNL. Not exactly bang to rights, but it wouldn't take much to put two and two together. "Looks like a long break." "Just going away for a while. I'm owed time off, bored at work and nothing to do at home. Why would the police come and ask me about a holiday? I've been on loads of them in the past and never had a call from the cops. We have a few questions to ask you. Where are you going?" "I'm going to where the weather suits my clothes." "Good answer. Where might that be?" "I was just going to head to Scotland for a little bit." "Know anyone there?" "Not yet, but I do tend to make friends easily." "Do you make enemies easily?" "Not unless they get on the wrong side of me." "Made any recently?" Augustine asked. "Not that I'm aware of." "Do you know a man called McManus?" Johnny twitched. "Never heard of him." "Are you sure? It's really important." "Nope. The name rings a bell, but I can't put a face to it. Should I know him?" "Well, seeing as you played golf with him yesterday, there's a good chance that you should know him, yes." "Oh, that Mark. I forgot his surname," Lawton replied, not fooling anyone. "Yes, that Mark McManus." "Yeah, I know him. We went to school together, lost touch for a while. He connected with me recently and asked for a game. How's he doing?" Johnny asked, feeling regret over his actions the day before. Asking after him was part of the plan to relieve his guilt. He didn't know what else he had to do, but the feeling wasn't subsiding. "He's not. He's dead." "What the fuck?" "Found face down in the car park at the golf club last night. We're here to speak to you about that, not about your holiday. Do you have anything enlightening to say?" "No," Johnny mumbled. "Johnny Lawton, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Mark McManus." Augustine continued to read his rights. Chapter 10. With Johnny Lawton in a cell awaiting his solicitor, Augustine walked along the narrow corridors towards the records department and his friend, Lou. The two of them had worked together for a number of years, and one thing Augustine knew about Lou was that he was a member of the George Washington Golf Club, but rarely played. Lou was a member because of the facilities. Some of his friends played golf. Lou, being a member, meant he could meet them there for a drink or a meal and the very occasional round. It didn't happen very often, but Lou had the cash to have an almost redundant membership for those rare occasions he was invited. Augustine carried 2 cups of tea. Lou welcomed everyone, every time. But he was even more welcoming when the visitor brought him drinks and/or biscuits. Augustine didn't have the time to buy biscuits, but was more than capable of rustling up a couple of cuppers. "Gus!" Lou exclaimed. He hadn't seen his friend and former colleague for a few weeks, nearing a month. "Lou, how are you?" Augustine replied, placing 2 hot drinks down on the desk between them. He didn't wait to be invited to take a seat. The worn leather chair, as red as a British postbox, was his chosen pew. It creaked as he sat down. Augustine thought about cracking a joke about breaking wind, but thought better of it. He could be called back to interview Johnny Lawton at any time, and Lawton's solicitor was Cal Green, so he needed to be on top of his game. Green was the solicitor for all the lowlifes in town. "I'm good, Gus. How are you? Anything new?" "You're a poet and you don't know it. Yes, I'm good. I've come for a chat. Sorry to be straight to the point, but I might be called away at any moment. Just after some information. Promise the next visit will be a longer one." "Shoot! You're still a member at that golf club?" "Yes. Why?" "Well, we were called out for a body in the car park this morning. The guy had been strangled to death, apparently, face down overnight. Just looking for a bit of background information, if you have any." "Well, the place has been taken over by a big chain a few years ago. They spent a lot of money on it, building it up from pretty much rack and ruin. I'm sure they won't like a dead body in their money-making machine. Anyone we know?" "The guy was called Mark McManus, but he's not on our system for anything in the past. Not sure if he's mixed up in something. We've got someone in for questioning, suspicion of murder. He played around with Mark last night, claimed he didn't know the guy. It will be interesting to see what he has to say for himself when his solicitor arrives." "Cal Green?" "Yes. How did you know?" "Just a hunch. Wherever there's a dodgy crim, there's a dodgy solicitor." "You're not wrong there. Do you think this is the guy?" "Well, why would he pretend he didn't know someone who he played golf with the night before? Someone who was found dead the very next morning. And he was packing his car up for a long trip. He had filled just about every spare space. Told us he was owed time off at work. Looked like he was going into hiding to me." "Did he give you a reason he was leaving in a hurry?" Lou asked. "Just said he was going to Scotland for a while. I wonder if that while was long enough for the heat to die down." "Maybe. That club attracts a certain type. There's the business crowd, people who network over a game of golf and 10 pints afterwards. The pro there is a bit of an arsehole, Daniel Godfrey. I've had the pleasure of meeting him this morning." "What did you think?" Lou asked. "No, you first. Why do you call him an arsehole?" "There's just an edge, Gus. He has a certain way about him. It's almost as though he's trying to keep everyone at arm's length. He's got something to hide, that's for sure." "Well, he didn't manage to keep Electra at arm's length. He ignored us, so she went behind the reception area and brought him out, grabbed his wrist. He didn't like that, but his demeanour changed when he realised it was a woman manhandling him, or woman handling him, or whatever you should call it. He's definitely got an eye for the ladies as Daniel Godfrey. If you want a lesson, then you stand much more of a chance if you're a female. More chance still if you're under 50 and pretty much nailed on if you want putting lessons. That way he can have his hands all over you." "Is that why your golf game never got any better?" "Maybe, but those are the kind of lessons I could do without. Keep an eye on him, Gus. He's a slippery one." "Thanks, Lou, and I promise the next conversation will be with biscuits and for longer." "How about beers and away from here?" Lou asked. "Deal." Chapter 11. Starting interview with Johnny Lawton and his representative Cal Green. Interviewing officers are Detective Augustine Boyle and Detective Electra King. Shall we begin? Lawton looked at his solicitor for advice. He nodded. Lawton said, Yes. Johnny Lawton, do you know Mark McManus, this man here? Augustine asked, holding up an image of Mark McManus retrieved from his brother. The brother had made his way to the station when told of his sibling's demise. He was waiting in an interview room at the other end of the same corridor. Ash and Alice were due to speak to him. Yes, I do know him, Lawton replied, looking again at his solicitor for approval. Why, when questioned earlier, did you claim to not know Mark McManus? I told you before that I forgot his surname. Pull the other one. This is a guy who you just played golf with last night. Someone who you are linked to on social media. I put it to you that you have something to hide in your relationship with Mark. You denied that you knew him for a reason. Lawton looked at his solicitor. He was paralysed by the advice he had been given before the detectives entered the room. Augustine knew what the advice was. It was to keep his mouth shut and only answer questions that didn't incriminate him. But Johnny Lawton couldn't determine which answers might land him in trouble. So, he looked for advice with every question. My client won't be answering that question. We're here to deal with facts, not speculation. What if I was to sit here and speculate that one of you killed the guy? Would you allow that line of questioning? Cal Green asked. Fine, understood, Augustine responded. So, how did the game of golf go? What do you mean? Lawton replied. Who won? Electra added. Mark won. He's worked on his game a great deal, improved his athleticism since school. That was probably the last time I saw him, until yesterday. And what happened after the game? Augustine asked. We chatted in the car park and then we went our separate ways. Chatted about anything in particular? No, just about the game, about a rematch, about his kids. Just the same kind of thing that people talk about on golf courses, at pubs, at football matches up and down the country. And then you left. Yes. What time was this, Johnny? This is an important question. You might want to check with your solicitor on this one. Lawton looked at Cal Green, who nodded approval. Green had already been told by his client that he left the car park of the George Washington golf course more than 8 hours before the body was found. That gap was far too big for the detectives to conclusively link him to the crime. Around 9:15. Around 9:15, Augustine repeated, looking at the notes Electra was making. The interview was recorded, but the nuances of the moment were best recorded by pen and paper. You know, the little things that just can't be seen when a video or audio is replayed. The eye contact, the tension in the air, the almost imperceptible pauses. Who left first? Augustine asked. What? Who got in their car and left the car park first? Was it you or was it Mark McManus? I guess it was me. You guessed right. Mark was still there this morning. So, Johnny, tell me what really happened when you two left the golf course, because I know for a fact it wasn't the cock and bull story you've just told me. Mark didn't have kids, and even if he did, you wouldn't be interested. What happened? Johnny looked at the ground, hoping it would swallow him up. He'd hit the guy, and hit him hard. But surely he didn't die from the blows he'd landed. And the grab around his neck, maybe he did. There were repeated blows. He grabbed him pretty hard, and Mark was always a wuss. By admitting to giving him a few punches and a few kicks and choking him, was Johnny confessing to murder? He had no idea how to proceed. Raising his eyes from the floor, Johnny remembered where he was. He looked to the left and spied his solicitor glaring at him. He was told before the interview what the glare meant, but at that precise moment, he couldn't remember what that glare was for. No comment, he answered, suddenly recalling the words he was fed by Cal Green. And the rest of the interview went pretty much the same way. No matter how Augustine and Electra structured the questions, all aimed at finding out what happened between the two men, The response was a plain, "No comment." "I guess we'll have to keep you in until we can check the CCTV, Augustine said at the end. Cal Green wanted to object, but there was no reason to. His client had been the last reported person to see Mark McManus alive. If he was innocent, then the images would prove that. Otherwise, Cal Green would have to use all his prowess and cunning to get the man off, or at least get him a lesser charge. Chapter 12. Andy McManus sat looking at the wall like it would give him all the answers he needed. He was sat opposite Ash and Alice, but they had left a gap between them. The gap was all Andy could focus on. He'd come in with a picture of his brother. It took time for him to select the right one. The images Mark uploaded to social media were all when he'd had a drink, and it didn't look like him. At that point in time, Andy didn't know if the image would end up on the local news, national news, Crime Watch. He wanted it to be a good photo of his brother, one that displayed him as the good man he was. "Andy, can we ask you a few questions?" Ash asked. Nothing. The silence was eating them all up. The detectives who had been trained in this kind of thing felt his pain. But the man who was a simple accountant, no training for this kind of thing, was being destroyed by the questions bouncing around in his head. Why Mark? Who did this? What did they do? What did they take from him? What did they have against him? Did Mark have a life that I didn't know about? And it was the last of these questions that bothered Andy the most. If his brother was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, then Andy could heal someday. But if his beloved brother had a secret life that was hidden from him, then he wouldn't be able to cope. Andy hoped that the detectives could calm his fears with this. "Andy, we know how painful this is. We've spoken to hundreds of people in the same situation. I wish I didn't even have to have these conversations, but unfortunately I do. Now, I can give you a while to collect yourself, but we're against the clock here. Statistics show that the sooner we identify the potential suspects in any murder case, the higher our chance of actually bringing that person to justice," Alice explained. Andy nodded, then raised his finger. They gave him a moment. "I'm his only living relative. Our folks passed away years ago. Neither of us settled down, started a family, all that jazz. But we were happy. Mark spent his time and his money doing the things he wanted to do. He played golf, he went for meals with mates, me sometimes, and he went to the gym. Another passion was watching Sunderland. He led a simple life." "And can you think of anyone who might want to kill him? Might want to see him dead? I know this is a horrible thing to contemplate, but it will help us greatly," Ash asked. "He had enemies, he told me that, but an enemy for the like of you and me is different to an enemy for Mark. He wanted everyone to love him every moment of every day, and if they didn't, he fretted, thought of them as an enemy. Not someone he disliked, but someone he feared disliked him. He mentioned a girlfriend, but I've never met her. Not sure if she was a figment of his imagination. He was like that, often imagining friends, girlfriends, new family members. It wasn't malicious, just Mark." "So, would anyone want to harm him, or see him come to harm?" Alice asked. "Not that I can think of," Andy replied, wiping a tear that had run too far down his cheek to disguise. "Thank you," Alice responded, handing him a tissue. "Can I ask you something?" Andy said, after composing himself. "Of course," the two detectives replied at the same time. "Did he have a life that I don't know about? Mark, I mean." "We're really early in the investigation, and you're the first person who knew him we've spoken to. I'll keep you updated with how we're getting on, seeing as you're his next of kin, but I can't tell you anything that would break data protection protocols. I'm sure you'll already know that," Alice detailed, while pushing her business card over the desk towards the distraught brother. "Thank you." They were done. So many people who died seemed to have no reason to die. No enemies, no motive. Alice looked at the clock and made a note of the time the interview finished. She spoke quietly to the microphone, and it was all over. They filed from the room and left Andy for a few moments to collect his thoughts. As Andy sat there, his phone buzzed. He looked at the message and smiled. It read, "I hear you're going to be a very rich man." Chapter 13. PC Sarah Land sat pointing the speed gun at the road. It was a thankless task, one that the rest of the force tried to dodge with all their might. It was the point in policing that received the most abuse. You got less hassle from drunken idiots streaming out of nightclubs in the city centres than you did trying to catch speeding drivers. The narrative had already been set that the motorist was being fleeced for their hard-earned cash by taxation, and then paying even more because they were a few miles per hour over the speed limit was a conduit to rage. She had been spat at, sworn at more times than she cared to remember, and the hand gestures were more common than actually catching someone. She sat on the Paterson Road, a usual haunt for speeding motorists, and hence speed cameras. Sarah had been there for an hour, taking in the unseasonal sunshine as well as watching the dark clouds on the horizon. She was due to finish her shift in a couple of hours and had left the washing out before she left home. She hoped she would get back before the rain, or all the hard work of the sunshine that morning would be wasted. A red Fiat Bravo came flying around the bend. She watched the speedometer on her speed gun go through 30, 40, and 50 before looking away as it got to eye-watering speeds. The driver waved his hand out of the window as he slowed down. As he got closer, she could see that it was a fist rather than a hand. She knocked on the partition between the front and back of the Ford Transit van that constituted a mobile speed camera. This one was trouble. She could see that from the speed he was now going. As the car slowed to a halt in front of the Transit, blocking it from catching any other speeders, the man started shouting. The two police officers manning the camera alighted and walked towards him. PC Sarah Land and her colleague, PC Simon Street, had seen this many times before. As soon as they got close, the driver would slap their foot on the accelerator and be out of sight. But they got out so their body cameras could catch the abuse. It would be far more compelling in court later on than their simple written testimony. This man had taken a simple speeding ticket, £100-odd fine, and 3 points on his licence, and turned it into a court case for abuse. Not the brightest. As predicted, when they got close, the man put his foot on the accelerator to get away. But he wasn't totally in control and stalled the car. By the time he'd worked out what was going on, PC Sarah Land had opened the car door. He was on the grass, looking up at two police officers seconds later. The strong smell of alcohol reached their faces, even though his mouth was down by their knees. A breath test later, and the man was in the back of the transit van, waiting for a police car to take him to the station. PC Land asked him his name. "Daniel Godfrey," was the reply. Chapter 14. Augustine got through to Joyce Mccarty after 3 attempts. The first 2 went to voicemail. He didn't leave one. He wanted to speak to her. There was no answer phone message that could convey the message. How do you tell someone that a body has been found in the car park of the golf club she manages? "Joyce Mccarty?" "That's my name. Try not to wear it out," she answered chirpily. Augustine guessed that she hadn't received the news. "Where are you?" Augustine asked. "I'm at home enjoying a relaxing day off. By the way, who are you?" she remembered to ask, so caught up in the jollity of unexpected sunshine and a day off coinciding. It never happened like this. "I'm afraid I'm the person calling to cancel your day off." "Are you from head office?" "Worse." "Well, you're not my ex-husband, so I'm stumped." "I'm Detective Augustine Boyle. There's been a body found in the car park of George Washington Golf Club. Can you meet us there?" The cry at the other end of the phone confirmed for Augustine that she had no idea of the news. It took her a full 30 seconds to compose herself and speak again. Of course, I'm in Gateshead at the moment. Will you give me 20 minutes to make myself decent and get over there?" "Of course. Let the police officer on the gate know your name. I'll make sure they'll let you in." "Thank you," Joyce Mccarty replied. 20 minutes later, on the button, Joyce arrived. She was wearing the tightest blue jeans that Augustine had ever seen, coupled with a white vest top that showed off her figure. Toned and tanned arms indicated that she used the facilities at the gym and spa attached to the golf club and hotel. Her wavy blonde hair looked like it needed taming, but completed the look of a sassy woman who was ready for just about any situation, maybe except for the one that she was about to walk into. Her jewellery was all costume. No value to it, but the size of each piece appeared far too big for her frame, especially the ring on her finger that glistened in the light a reddish brown. Joyce Mccarty had no idea what to expect. She didn't know if the body had already been cleared from the car park. She didn't know if they would show her images of the dead person. She had no idea if she would be shown CCTV images of the grisly act. "Joyce?" Electra asked as the woman walked across the car park. "The one and only," she responded, trying to put her bravest face on. "Electra," the detective responded, offering a handshake. Joyce shook more hands than she dared count in her normal day-to-day role, but that was when she was wearing a suit and a name badge. Today, she was in her civvies and wasn't used to greeting people in that guise. "And this is Augustine." Greetings over, they walked into the clubhouse. The fact that they were away from the car park was a huge comfort to Joyce, but she still had other worries. "Take a seat," she said to the two detectives as they entered her office. They all sat down, and the silence stayed for 10 seconds. "Thank you for coming in. We've got a few questions for you. Are you okay to answer a few questions?" Electra asked. Joyce nodded. "Do you know Mark McManus?" she asked. "No. Is he the man who was found dead?" "We'll ask the questions if that's all right. Are you sure? He's been a member here for years, as far as we understand." "I'm sure. We have over 1,600 members. I can't keep up with them all. The name doesn't ring any bells, but if you have a photo, then I'll see if I can recognize him." Augustine reached into a file and pulled out the image Andy McManus had given the police. It had been blown up, so it filled an A4 piece of paper. This was the image the police were circulating as part of their inquiries. Andy had chosen well. "No, I don't recognize him. The golfers pretty much come and go. They're here for a round of golf, but that takes up enough of their time. Once finished, most are off. A handful are here for the social aspect, but they are usually either wealthy to a point where they don't have to go out to work, or they're retired. He doesn't fit either profile from what I can deduce. What did he do for a living?" Augustine looked at Electra. "He worked on the oil rigs, 4 weeks on, 4 weeks off. More on if they needed extra," Electra responded. "So wealthy, but not that wealthy?" "Yes. Do you know Johnny Lawton?" Augustine asked. "Yes, that one I don't need a photo for. He isn't a very good player, always blaming the course, the pro, the tee positions, anything other than his game. I've had more complaints from Lawton than all the other members put together, and remember that we've got more than 1,600 of those. He's a lousy player and a lousy human being, from my experience. Why, is he part of this?" "No comment," Electra responded, mimicking the responses she had got from Lawton during the interview. "I think I have a right to know if another of my members had been injured here, or worse," Joyce responded, sitting upright in her chair, her blue eyes widening moment by moment. "He's not injured, believe me. Has there been any feuds in the golf club recently? Anything that Mark could have been involved in?" "Every now and again we get wind of people going against each other. Groups form, people blank each other, you know. But we're usually the last ones to know. It's all happened and blown over by the time we get to find anything out. and by then it's all gossip and conjecture. Joyce smiled at her use of the word conjecture. She liked using big words, but got fed up with having to explain them afterwards to members of the team who were just there for the cash. "We understand that you have an extensive CCTV system here. Can we take a look?" Augustine asked. "Who told you that?" "We had the pleasure of meeting Dan Godfrey this morning," Electra explained. "Dan? He's harmless when you get to know him. He looks like a tiger from the outside, but when you get near enough, he's really a pussycat." Electra and Augustine exchanged glances. They were sure to talk about that sentence later, but they didn't want to dwell on it at that time. There were a few shady characters in the case, but this was all speculation, or conjecture, as Joyce Mccarty said, so they needed to add some evidence to the mix, preferably something conclusive. "The CCTV?" Augustine asked, moving things on. "Shall we?" Joyce deftly managed the CCTV system. "What time are we looking at?" she asked. "Let's start at 8 last night, and the cameras in the car park, if you will," Augustine requested. He felt that much of Joyce's good humour had deserted her, and wanted to put some light into a dark situation. 8 car park, Joyce muttered, as she pressed keys and moved a joystick that looked like an oversized version of the Pac-Man games Augustine played as a child in the arcades. He wondered if arcades were still a thing now that home consoles had graphics far beyond anything he could have imagined as a kid. 8 car park, Joyce repeated as she clicked the button again. This time there was a degree of consternation in her voice. "What's wrong, Joyce?" Electra asked, picking up on it. "There doesn't seem to be an 8 yesterday in the system. It's like we're on repeat." She clicked away, trying for a different result when she knew that wouldn't be the case. She clicked a different button, then sat back in her chair with the biggest sigh of her life. "What is it?" "Joyce, what is it?" "Someone has reset the CCTV system. They have changed the time to yesterday evening, so last night has been wiped over with this morning. I can see them in the office making a change, and then it goes off." "Someone?" Electra asked. "Specifically, Dan Godfrey," Joyce responded. Chapter 15. "So, what do you think about the relationship between Joyce and Daniel?" Augustine asked. It sounded like gossip, but it was far more than that. He needed to know if there was something there for the sake of the investigation. "Well, she was pretty quick to drop him in it with the CCTV, wasn't she?" Electra responded, with a question of her own. She felt there was a significance until that point. But she called him Dan, and what did he say? "My friends can call me that." Sounds like she's a friend, maybe more. The way he goes about his business, I doubt he's got many of those. And the look in her eyes when he was mentioned, it felt like a lot more. "I'm with you on that, but we don't convict people on feelings now, do we, Gus? We convict them on hard evidence. I've lost count of the number of times you've told me that. So what hard evidence do we have at this point in time?" "Not a great deal. We've gathered DNA evidence from the scene, but it doesn't match anything we have on record. So the person is clean in the past, first-time criminal. And that means we've got a lot of work to do in order to find a lead, chase it down, and then match it with the DNA. Any ideas?" "Well, I think that the beer bottle at the scene is significant. We've got someone who says it isn't just unusual, it's never happened before. And that means if we find the owner of that bottle of beer, we find the killer." "I agree, Electra. So when we get back to the station, we have a couple of things to do. And I'd say the first of those is to release Johnny Lawton. The CCTV was our route to keeping him in longer. As it stands, we don't have anything to keep him in for. I'll let Cal Green know. You let Johnny know. Sound like a deal?" "You've definitely got the rough end of that bargain, Gus." The pair laughed. Electra looked at Augustine and wondered what life might be like if they were together. Here she was, bouncing away from another man, another failed relationship. And there was Augustine, dependable, steady, and a good man. She had a penchant for the bad boys, and then questioned why they continued to be bad. Gus was settled down with Christine, and they had a beautiful girl who was somewhere between the ages of 1 and 2. Electra was never any good at remembering ages or birthdays, but she was sure Nightingale was between those ages. In fact, she'd put money on it. But she knew why they weren't together. It was because they weren't compatible. It was because she always wanted something different. It was because they had never had the conversation with each other about being anything other than colleagues, and it would stay that way. As they reached the police station, both prepared internally for the conversation they were about to have. Electra's would be full of cheer. The man was being released, and he would be desperately happy. She would tell him that he was under strict instructions to go nowhere, especially not on his proposed trip to Scotland, where he could quite easily disappear. Augustine's conversation would be full of gloating. Cal Green celebrated loudly and excessively every small win over the police. It was one of the main reasons why he was employed by the criminal underworld. He was definitely one of them. He loved nothing better than rubbing Augustine's nose in it. After the conversations, the pair were due to meet back up again and talk through their next steps. It had been a long day already with the early start. Electra was even more tired because of the night she'd spent on the sofa. Even though they wanted to get some rest, both knew that they wouldn't be able to do that without a plan of action. "Gus?" the voice went as he ventured back towards their office. It was Lou. "Lou, how's things?" "Just wondered if you fancied that drink this evening." He was closing in on his wedding anniversary. His wife had died over a decade ago. He didn't want to be alone. Augustine searched the back of his mind and guessed that it was nearly that time of the year again. "Of course. Does 8 o'clock sound okay? Weatherspoons in Concord?" "Yes, mate," Lou replied eagerly. As the two men finished their conversation, they were forced to one side by a police officer taking someone from a cell to the front desk. "Good afternoon. Excuse me," PC Sarah Land said, looking at the two detectives as she walked. She recognized them from before, particularly the younger one. He had been in the newspapers an awful lot over the previous few years. Awful injury. Everyone was glad that he was back on the force, solving crimes, being a valued member of the team again. As she passed, the older man looked in her direction and smiled. The younger man looked lost in his thoughts. Either that or he was trying to crank the damaged brain into gear. At the last second, before the female police officer went out of view and thought he was rude, Augustine looked up and replied, "Good afternoon. Hang on a second. Who's that?" "This is a drunk driver. He is sobered up and will be either walking home, getting on a bus, or calling for a taxi. I don't care which one, but he won't be driving, that's for sure," PC Land explained. "He won't be going anywhere for a while, will you, Daniel?" Augustine replied. Daniel Godfrey looked up and mouthed an obscenity under his breath before following it up with 2 words. "No, copper." "Lou, can you get Electra for me? Tell her we're in interview room number 4. She'll be pleasantly surprised who she meets in there, but tell her no more than that." Lou left in the opposite direction, already knowing where Electra would be. The news that Johnny Lawton was released had already reverberated around the station. Lou put 2 and 2 together and guessed that she would be the one letting him know. Augustine pointed to the interview room with the number 4 stenciled on it. "Right, Daniel. Shall we?" Chapter 16. "Thanks for meeting me at such short notice," Andy McManus said. "Not a problem at all." There Andy was, sat in the office of a financial advisor, who was also a friend, Barry Branson. Barry had looked after Andy and Mark's father's finances, and their father had introduced the 2 boys to Barry before he passed away. Now, Barry looked after their financial affairs. Plus, he and Andy had struck up a friendship over the years. "I needed someone to talk to. I know that I'll get the straight answers from you. Everyone is so sorry, so sympathetic. but that's not what I need right now. I need a bit of truth. Do you think that Mark had a life that I didn't know about? Do you think that he was doing things that he hid from me, hid from the rest of the world, that might have got him killed?" "A lot of questions there," Barry replied. He was like an uncle in the way that they get on famously, but there was a noticeable age gap. Barry stroked the long beard on his chin while he thought. He had worn a beard as long as Andy had known him. Somehow, it looked bang up to date and from the 1970s at the same time. His clothes were the same. A suit that could have been older than Andy, but looked in good nick. Shoes that his dad would have called winkle pickers, and bifocal glasses with a green tint. "And I think we can work these out one by one. He did have some business interests that you don't know about. With no kids, I'm sure you already know this, you can accumulate wealth at a pretty fast rate. Mark was worth many hundreds of thousands of pounds, and with that much money, he was always looking at alternative ways to make it work harder for him. With bank interest rates well below 0.5%, I don't blame him. One day, he asked if I knew anyone who was setting up a business venture that needed financial backing. Normally, I just tell people that's not my thing, but it just so happened that earlier that day I met someone who was doing just that. He wanted to set up a golf course, buying the empty land near the new Amazon warehouse on the edge of town. I connected the pair of them and even got involved in a small scale myself. I had no idea. Was this a legitimate deal? The deal? Yes. The businessman, I'm not so sure. He talked the talk, but I'm not sure he had the wherewithal to follow it all through. Mark was up to his eyeballs in the golf course. He read somewhere that Elon Musk is getting into golf courses. He thought that buying a golf course was a cash cow that would give milk forever. I tried to get him to diversify his investments, think about things. But he and Daniel Godfrey had already set up a limited company. Mark had deposited pretty much all of his cash in the company's bank account. "And what would happen to all that money in the event of Mark's death?" Andy asked, a face filled with worry. They had always promised each other that the first person they would look after in the event of their death was each other. "I'm not sure, but his will has all the details. In fact, I set up his will. I can get you a copy if you'd like. I don't suppose I'm breaking any confidentiality if the guy's already dead, am I? Sorry, your brother's awful demise has upset me to the point where I'm not making the right decisions. At least, that's my defense if I'm ever asked." "I'm game if you are," Andy responded. Barry was already tapping away at his computer to retrieve the file. "Well, well, well. I'm sure you won't be surprised to find that, in the event of Mark's death, all the money goes to the limited company. So, in effect, that means all of the money goes directly to Daniel Godfrey." "Little fucker!" Andy bellowed. Barry wasn't sure whether he was talking about his brother or Daniel Godfrey. He thought about inquiring, then decided he didn't want to know. Maybe it was both of them. "Yes, the entirety of his estate, excluding his home, that goes to you." Andy tapped his foot on the ground as though he needed to expend as much energy in a shorter space of time as possible. He looked up at the ceiling and let the tears run down his face. They collected at the bottom of his chin before dropping onto the floor. "A penny for your thoughts?" Barry Branson asked. "Where on earth can I find Daniel Godfrey?" Andy asked. "Funny you ask. I've just had a message from him to say that he's in the police station in the town centre, drink driving, and they're throwing a few other things at him too." Chapter 17. Electra sat down next to Augustine. Godfrey had declined the representation of a solicitor, said he didn't need one. Nothing to hide, nothing to prove. They pressed the point and he still refused. Augustine wouldn't sit in an interview on the other side of the desk without a solicitor present, and he knew the law pretty well. It always amazed him that people would sit and speak without someone next to them prompting when they should stop speaking, change the subject, or even answer for them. Daniel, we wanted to speak to you. We've been back to the golf course and found that you tampered with the CCTV system. Now, seeing as you've changed the date on the system just at the time a murder occurred, we've got some suspicions, Augustine started. To Electra, it sounded too much like a monologue. The one thing they had been taught was to keep their words short and sweet. A simple statement or a single question. She nudged Augustine with her knee in his thigh. He received the message, loud and clear. Can you enlighten us on why you chose that date and time to tamper with the system? I was trying to see if I could help. I wanted to get the images to help the investigation, but I don't know how to use the system. Ask anyone who's been around me. They all laugh that I don't know what I'm doing with it. But why didn't you leave it to someone who knew the system? Augustine pressed. I wanted to be the hero. I wanted to help. But what you've done is destroy any chance we had of seeing what happened. Not quite in fitting with the role of a hero, is it? Augustine asked. No. But I'm sure I can still help. Augustine mused about Daniel's demeanour. When they spoke to him the first time, he was about as welcoming as barbed wire. Now he was all sweetness and light, but it wasn't natural. The sweetness was the sober Daniel Godfrey, maybe. The one who only arrived when he wanted something, or someone. Augustine looked over at Electra. Maybe she had the knack with a man who thought with his penis more than his brain. She understood what was potentially going on and took over the questioning. Daniel, you were caught drink driving. What time this morning did you start drinking? Early. What's early for you? What's early for you, and see if we're compatible, Godfrey responded. Electra took it in her stride. If she wanted the man to talk freely, then she had to let him loosen his tongue a little. Weekdays, it's before 5. Weekends, it's 10. How's that for you? I'll see you at the weekend. Early for me is around 6:30, 7, and I often have a drink for breakfast. So, when we asked you this morning how you got to the course, you said that you walked. Is that true? I walked in because my car was still there from the night before. Joyce could smell the drink on me and wouldn't let me drive home. She took my keys and gave me a lift home. So, what made you think that drinking for breakfast and jumping in the car was a good formula? Electra pressed, knowing that he was warming to her. She sat forward. He mirrored. I've done it so many times before and got away with it. Nothing new for me. And did you see anything in the car park before you started work that can help us with our inquiries? I saw a body. I saw Mark. Well, I assume it was Mark. He was laid face down by his car. I finished my drink, left it on the wall next to him, and went back to my daily business. By then, I could see that there was nothing I could do for him. So you left him there. He could have still been alive. He could still have had a chance, however small. Not from where I was standing. He was a goner. Dan, I don't know what to say. I thought more of you. Tell me what you saw. Probably the same as what you've seen. He was laid next to his car, face down. There was blood. Nothing else, really. Just like that. Like I say, I knew he was dead. Dan, can we take a sample of your DNA to check our records? If you're innocent, and I believe that you're innocent, then it will help to eliminate you from our inquiries and allow us to focus on the real killer. How does that sound? Oh, that's fine. Will you be doing it? Daniel Godfrey asked hopefully. No, we've got a team for that, Electra replied. Chapter 18. Andy made his way to the police station as fast as his legs could carry him. He might have hailed a cab or even gone back home to collect his car, but there was an energy inside him that he needed to burn off before he got there. If Daniel Godfrey was stood right in front of him there and then, he'd rip the guy's head off. The walk allowed him to process things in his head. It's Mark's money. He can make the decision on what goes on with it. I'm financially secure. But the opposite side still burned within him. The peace he found with the above comments disappeared with the thoughts below. Why should Daniel Godfrey have it? It should stay in the family. Mark has been conned. And it was the potential of the last thought that burned hottest inside of him. If Mark had been duped, then it was up to Andy to uncover and repair the injustice. And that would start with confronting Daniel Godfrey. That man had a great deal to answer for. But it was all on a whim. What were the chances of Daniel Godfrey being there when he arrived? What were the odds of him even recognizing the guy? He'd asked Barry to send him some pictures of the man, something that would help him find the bastard. But Andy knew it was a long shot. Not only that, but it was also a long game. Andy was prepared. He had nothing else to live for but preserving his brother's wealth. As Andy reached the police station, he checked his phone for the images Barry, the IFA, had sent him. They were from the internet. Some images of Daniel Godfrey, or Dan as he called himself on social media. Armed with the images, he would know who Dan Godfrey was and be able to have it out with him. Most people didn't like to air their dirty laundry in public. Andy wasn't like that. And, at any rate, he didn't think it was his dirty laundry. It was Godfrey's. Looking down at his phone and then up at the steps of the police station, Andy couldn't quite believe his eyes. The man who he came to see, the man who he thought it might prove difficult to track down, was there, looking up at the sky as though he was adjusting to the light. "Oi, Godfrey! Get over here, you bastard!" Daniel Godfrey considered running, but where would he run to? Where was safer than the police station steps? "What?" he responded, standing his ground and tensing his muscles like it was a necessity in this situation. The guy looked tiny, but as he got closer, Godfrey realized that he might have been short, but made up for it in muscle. "You conning git! You might have pulled the wool over my brother's eyes, but you don't fool me. I'll take you to the fucking cleaners over this. Mark my words!" By now, Andy was running. There were a few bystanders alerted by the shouting and running, but none from inside the police station. Again, Godfrey considered running but thought better of it. He'd been chased and shouted at many times before. It was water off a duck's back. But this time, with the eyes of the police burning a hole in the back of his neck, it felt different. He felt guilty. He'd run away a few times before, too. Usually the boyfriends or husbands of women he'd charmed. Better to get out of there than stand that one down. When passion took over, there was no winner. "What's your problem? I don't even know your brother, fucking idiot!" There Dan went, back to his old self. He felt confidence rush through his veins and the feelings of guilt dissipated. He was ready for an argument. He loved them. Godfrey had a boss when he worked in a supermarket that would keep a diary of when he should bawl out a team member. He would look and say, "It's Tuesday, time to have a go at Paul," and then proceed to scream and shout at Paul for some misdemeanor that was either real, historic, or made up. Godfrey watched him cheerfully tick it off in his diary and move on with his day. Godfrey liked this tactic, but not always Paul on a Tuesday. That was too obvious. Keep them on their toes. Keep them guessing. "Mark McManus, a better man than you. He has put all his trust in you, put all his money in you. What were you thinking? Do you even have a conscience? Listen, I'm sorry about your brother. Sorry? What for? For his death, for your loss. But you aren't sorry that you fleeced him dry. You aren't sorry that he left every penny he had to you." Daniel Godfrey stopped in his tracks. Until that point, he felt like an argument. But now, he felt like laughing. He felt like all his Christmases had come at once. Could it really be true? Could he have all the money? It would certainly help keep the wolves at bay, that was for sure. Holding back his laughter, his glee, Godfrey held out his hand as a peace offering to Mark's brother. That was never going to be accepted. Andy swiped his hand away and aimed a punch at the ribs of the man who had persuaded his brother to give up all his money. Godfrey sidestepped it and offered a push in return. Not wanting to escalate the situation, he wanted to just get the man away. And he had the higher ground. Andy came back again, this time aiming for the ankles of the man stood above him. That way, the higher ground would mean nothing. Andy grabbed one ankle, then followed with the other and pulled with all his might. Godfrey landed with a bump, his ribs bouncing off 2 concrete steps at the same time, the wind disappearing from his lungs. Andy straddled the other man and started raining blows down on his shoulder, even though he targeted the side of his head. Andy sat up and took a deep breath. The man he was sat on top of was covering his head with his hands, raising his shoulder to blunt the attack. Andy couldn't help but feel that this guy had been hit before, more than once. As Andy leant forward to renew his attack, he felt an arm under each shoulder. "Not here, Andy, not now," Ash said, as he and Augustine picked the guy off Daniel Godfrey. Expecting a backlash from Godfrey, Ash handed Andy to Gus and stepped between the 2 men. But Daniel Godfrey was having none of it. He turned and ran. "Andy, we know you're hurting, but that's not the man who killed your brother," Ash explained. "Are you sure about that? Do you know what he did?" Andy screamed at the top of his lungs. Ash looked at him, scolding with his eyes the same way you do a child. Andy calmed. "Let's go inside and talk about this," Augustine said. The 3 men went and took a seat in the nearest available room. "Interview room 1 is taken," Augustine shouted over to the desk sergeant as they walked inside. The desk sergeant rolled his eyes and made a note. Better to just let them get on with it, rather than argue with the detective. They had work to do. "What's all this about, Andy?" Ash asked. "Grief comes out in so many ways. Believe me, this isn't a good one." "This isn't grief. This is revenge." "Revenge for what?" Ash queried. "You know what they say in most criminal investigations, don't you? Follow the money. And if you follow the money with this one, there's only one place you end up. That's squarely at the door of Daniel Godfrey." "I'm sorry, Andy. I don't follow." "All of Mark's money. All of it. It's gone to Daniel Godfrey. The savings, the investments, the money in the will. I've seen it." "We've spoken to Daniel, and he's offered to give us a sample of his DNA. We're seeing if he's a match for what was found at the scene. My guess is that he wasn't there," Ash replied, looking at Augustine for approval. It was implicit. "Well, if it wasn't him, then he paid someone to do it. He's not short of cash now that my brother is dead." This does not put a different light on things, and we will be speaking to Daniel Godfrey again. But let us eliminate him from the scene and work from there. If you can get us a copy of Mark's will, then we've got something concrete to go on. Augustine spoke, ending the conversation. Andy nodded. He would get the will, but he would also watch Daniel Godfrey like a hawk. The man had some explaining to do. If it wasn't to the police, then it would be to him. Chapter 19. "Cheers!" Lou said, as Augustine placed the 2 pints of lager on the table between them. Wetherspoons in Concord was a strange choice of venue. Here, criminals rubbed shoulders with each other. A couple of cops in the place turned most of the conversation straight. There was too much risk talking about dodgy deals when there were 4 police ears in the room. "Cheers. How's things with you?" Augustine replied. Same old, but neither of us want to talk about that, do we?" "If you say so. You know I'm here. I may not be as good as you at listening, but I'm always willing to give it a go if you need it." Lou had deliberately chosen the table in the farthest corner for that reason. If he did want to talk, then there would be nobody within earshot to pick up on the conversation.
I'm sure the case that you're working on is a better topic of conversation than little old me,
Lou replied, with a glint in his eye. Augustine knew that this would help take his mind off his own situation, so obliged. Follow the money, Lou.
Now, I've heard that in a million different briefings. What does that have to do with us enjoying a drink here?
Lou responded, clicking at the app, ordering the next round. He had been shown the app to get food and drink delivered straight to the table a little while back and loved the way it worked. No more waiting at the bar. No more spilling pints on the journey back to the table. If only he could get an app to go to the loo for him. Mark's brother told us to follow the money. And? We followed it. Well, we didn't even know the money was there at the time. But where the money turned out to be, we followed it. And the man at the end of that trail has given us his DNA. I'm 100% sure that we won't find him present at the scene of the murder. So where does that lead us?
Are you sure that's the end of the trail?
What do you mean, Lou?
Well, they say that behind every great man, there's a great woman.
Didn't have you as an Aretha Franklin fan.
What?
The lyrics. Never mind. Go on.
And behind every terrible man can be a terrible woman.
And what would a woman do with a golf course?
A golf course?
Lou asked. That's where the money is going. Mark McManus had invested in a golf course. Well, the plans for a golf course. You know, the empty land near where the Amazon warehouse has been built?
Yes.
That's been bought by a company owned by Daniel Godfrey, Mark McManus, and a few minor shareholders.
And have you eliminated these minor shareholders from your inquiry?
Not yet. New information. We only found out from Mark's brother. There's a handful of them. Some names I recognise from local business. But nobody that set our spidey senses whirring. There's a company as one of the shareholders. Looks like they're registered in the Cayman Islands. Don't know if you can look that up for us, Lou?
Yeah, of course. But don't expect miracles. I know it feels like a dead end, Gus, but that's often when you find a clue that solves the case. We've been doing this long enough to know what it's like.
So, what do people do with money, Lou? I've never had enough for it to be a problem.
I don't know. I'm pretty much the same as you financially, I guess. Some buy property, some invest. Some people buy cars, go on holidays, and others buy expensive jewellery.
What?
Expensive jewellery. You know, those big chunky rings, chains like a wrapper, and watches covered with jewels. Not my taste, but that's what floats some people's boats.
Lou, you've just sparked something in my mind. It's a long shot, but it might be the clue you spoke about.
Care to share it with me?
Well, not now, but you'll be the first to hear about it if it comes to something. Chapter 20. Daniel Godfrey and Joyce Mccarty were sat up in bed together. Daniel wanted to spark up a cigarette in celebration, but Joyce wouldn't let him smoke inside. He tried it once and still bore the mental scars from the ear-bashing he received.
I spoke to the police today several times, Dan stated.
Oh, what did they say?
They wanted to know why I fiddled with the CCTV system. I've given them my DNA to eliminate me from the scene.
Anything else?
Wanted to know if I knew Mark and a guy called Johnny Lawton. I wonder if he's a suspect.
I wonder too, Joyce replied, with an energy in her voice Dan hadn't recognised before. How's your day been? Will you marry me? Joyce asked Dan. He laughed. Not the laugh out loud kind of laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. One that told Joyce he had no intention of marrying her. She shrunk down and placed her head under the duvet cover for a few seconds, wiping the false tears from her eyes.
"Joyce, I thought this was a bit of fun," Dan pleaded, trying to lift the duvet away from her face.
She clamped her hands around it as tightly as she could. There was no moving it.
"I know that's how it started, but we've got so much more to do in life. I thought we might do it together,"
Joyce replied, trying her best to fake an upset voice. Would he notice? Was it convincing?
"Well, let me think about it."
"What if you don't have much time to think about it?"
she asked, pushing the duvet down, smearing her eyes with it as she did to leave panda eyes that were as close as she could manage to teary eyes at short notice.
"Why would you say that? I'll be here for a long time yet."
"I bet that's what Mark McManus would have said a couple of days ago."
"But I'm not Mark McManus. There's nobody out there trying to kill me, and even if they did, I could handle myself."
"What's that mark on your lip?"
she asked, pushing her finger into the top right portion of his upper lip. Dan winced. Joyce laughed. She enjoyed seeing the physical pain on him, the same way he liked the emotional pain affecting her.
"Well, nothing," he replied.
He didn't want to have that conversation with her. He didn't want to have that conversation with anyone.
"What's wrong with me?"
she asked, imagining the saddest time of her life in order to start the waterworks. Joyce lost both of her parents within weeks of each other. She used to sit there day after day, not knowing how she would get back on with her life again. She thought that things would never be the same again. In many ways, she was right, but she found a way to survive and get back into something that resembled life.
"Nothing. I said I'd think about it. You just took me by surprise, that's all,"
Dan responded, leaning in to give her a kiss on the cheek. She recoiled. He left her to it. If she was going to be like that, then he didn't want to marry her. This wasn't a game. It was life.
"I'm going to sleep,"
she said, in an attempt to gain the upper hand in the conversation. Dan Godfrey didn't care enough and laid with his back to her. As he drifted off, Joyce laid there with her eyes closed, pretending that she had drifted off. Instead, she was plotting. If Daniel Godfrey wasn't going to take the rap for this crime, then she had to find someone else who would. Chapter 21. The next morning, Daniel Godfrey received a phone call from the detective whose number he saved in his phone. She was a looker, much younger than Joyce. Maybe she'd had second thoughts and wanted something more than a suspect-detective relationship. He walked quickly out of the bedroom, downstairs, and to the end of the garden to take the call. He hadn't got dressed, was still in just his boxers. The morning dew felt cold on the soles of his feet. He liked it, resembling a tickle but without the unpleasantness. Dan Godfrey resolved to do this more often.
"Hey,"
he answered. Was that how those under 40 answered the phone? He mused. "Daniel Godfrey?" she asked. She'd gone back to calling him Daniel. That didn't bode well.
"That's my name. Don't wear it out," he responded.
Daniel had no idea why he'd said that. He'd never used those words before. He'd heard them somewhere recently. Couldn't put his finger on where. "We'd like to talk to you. There's a few things that have come to light, and we'd like your take on them," Electra explained.
"When?"
"Seeing as the golf course is still closed, and you don't have anything else to do, we thought maybe now."
"I'll be there as soon as I can,"
he said, looking up at the bedroom window, seeing no movement from Joyce's room. He'd leave a note. It was easier that way. Much easier than having a conversation. Dan grabbed his clothes from the ironing pile on the back of the sofa in the dining room. He hadn't moved in, far from it, but he had quite a bit of gear at Joyce's place. He got in the car, happy with himself that he hadn't had a drink that morning. 20 minutes later, he was sat opposite the young woman detective and her older colleague. "Dan, thanks for coming in." Dan again. Maybe she was interested.
"You're most welcome,"
he replied, placing his hands on the table as close as he could manage to hers. She pulled her hands away. Dan, can you tell us about the golf course you and Mark McManus were planning to build? Is build even the right word when it comes to constructing something so green?
It's the word I'd use. We're in business together. That's what we've achieved so far.
Well, in our line of work, one of the things we look at is who stands to benefit most when someone dies unexpectedly. At the moment, that appears to be you.
And
that lands you pretty high on our list of suspects. We've got the DNA, and you hadn't touched Mark before or after he died.
Ha! Told you!
But that doesn't mean you hadn't paid someone else to kill him. From what we hear, you're in the money now.
If only that was true.
What do you mean?
I'm skint. Even if Mark had $1 million hidden up his sleeve that will only keep the wolves at bay, the course has hit problem after problem. First, we were sued by Amazon for accidentally cutting their power cable. We had to fix that one in a jiffy. Then we found a rare species of caterpillar on the site. I'd love to have just gone ahead, but some environmental goody-two-shoes charity found out, and we've been under immense pressure to relocate these fucking caterpillars. I said just wait until they turned into butterflies and then we could build. They wouldn't be there. But apparently that's not the case. Protection of natural habitat or some old guff. Then we found an old mine shaft there too. Dug a 20-foot hole that turned into a 100-foot chasm in seconds. Why else do you think I was wiping the CCTV pictures?
What's the CCTV at one golf club got to do with a hole in the ground in the other? Electra asked.
It's a money pit. I wiped the CCTV because I didn't want people to see the images of me going through the lockers of the people on the golf course for a few quid. I can't put the heating on, don't have a penny in my bank account, and can't even feed myself. I'm staying at Joyce's because she has food. She thinks it's more than that. Even asked me to marry her this morning. But what she doesn't know is that I haven't got a pot to piss in.
You and Joyce? Augustine asked, faking surprise. He looked left to Electra, who was going through her own relationship troubles. She'd been back to her place overnight to find that Star had moved himself and all of his belongings out of there.
Yeah, and she likes the finer things in life. Don't know where she gets the cash from, but she's always got money to take us on holiday, go out for a nice meal, weekend break.
And where's Joyce now? Electra asked.
She doesn't know I'm here. She was still in bed when I left. Guess she's still there.
I wouldn't be so sure about that, Augustine replied. Chapter 22. Joyce popped back to the golf club. She knew all she needed from there, and it would only take a couple of minutes. She walked back to her car with a piece of paper in her hand. It was the piece of paper that might help her, might not. Only time would tell. She inputted an address in her sat-nav. It would take 4 minutes, the device told her. At the speeds she drove at, Joyce placed a bet with herself that it would take her less than 3. She was right. The house looked like it had been emptied, but Joyce had been inside enough homes belonging to single men to know that was the way they operated. No interior design flair, just throw something up and hope for the best. She approached the front door, pushed her boobs up to the top of her bra, and pulled her vest top down so the aforementioned boobs were on display. She never knew what charms she might need. Joyce had prepared all manner of incentives for the man behind this door. Joyce knocked and waited. She ran over the possibilities in her mind, deciding on what best to start with, money or sex. One would open the door, but which would seal the deal? The door opened. "Johnny Lawton?" she asked.
"Depends who's asking. I've had enough unwelcome visitors recently."
"I'm asking, Johnny."
"Who are you?"
"Let me in, and I'll tell you who I am and what I'm doing here," Joyce replied, checking in her handbag to ensure that the gun was still there. No reason for it not to be, just ensuring that she had that base covered too. She felt the coldness of the steel and a tingle ran up and down her spine. She loved situations like this. The nitty-gritty, she called it. The time when you sorted out those who were willing to do anything for success from those who talked about it, but when they faced success, just backed away. He walked back into the property without saying a word. She followed. Johnny picked up a golf club out of his bag that was propped up against the banisters at the bottom of the stairs. He turned left into the sitting room, grabbed a single seat, and motioned to her to choose one of the others available. A sofa and a seat that was identical to the one he had chosen. She went for the one the same as his. "What do you want?" he asked. Joyce sat opposite with her hand inside her handbag. "I have a proposition for you," she said in a low voice, looking down at her ample bosom, fluttering her eyelids. She knew he was watching her chest heave up and down. Joyce had a way with men of all ages. They couldn't help themselves. She had always put it down to the fact that she appeared fragile, but that was all an act. "Shoot," he said, not realizing the relevance of his words. "You already know that Mark McManus is dead?" "Yes, that's what I meant by unwelcome visitors." "And I know that the police have spoken to you about him." "Well, why don't you tell the police that it was you that killed him?" "Where do I start with that one? The fact that I didn't kill him? The fact that I'd be locked up? What's in it for me?" "Well, that depends entirely on what you want in exchange for it," Joyce uttered, in a low voice designed to be sexy. She wasn't sure whether the message got through, so she looked again at her breasts, knowing that Johnny's eyes were tracking the same piece of flesh as she was. "Do you think I'll confess to murder because you'll sleep with me? Is that what you're hinting at?" Johnny asked, still not able to take his eyes off her. His grip on the golf club had become weaker. She could see that too. "Well, that might be a good place to start, don't you think? I can help you with a defense too. Mark attacked you. I can tell the police that he has been known to attack others in the past. This time, in self-defense, you hit him. You protected yourself. And then you panicked, drove off, not thinking that the police would believe you. We can talk it over in bed if that works for you." "Sex with you isn't going to make me confess to a murder I didn't commit. What if the police don't buy the story? I've already told them something else. I'm sure you've done the same." "There's more to this. The person who actually did kill him is actually due to receive a huge sum of cash very soon. I think that they will reward you handsomely, in the hundreds of thousands. Not a bad exchange for a few years in prison, I'd bet. Have you ever seen what £100,000 looks like in notes?" "No." "I have. It's an impressive sight. Once you've seen it, the world never feels the same again. You become a slave to the money." "And do I really want that in my future? Get out of here!" Johnny shouted, while raising the golf club above his head with his right hand. The left hand was wrapped around Joyce's right arm and handbag. He rushed her to the front door and pushed her out before she could gain access to her handbag. Joyce knocked on the front door a couple more times, but there was no response. She checked her hair in the reflection of the glass and headed out into the street. As she looked right, Joyce swore under her breath. It was the last person she wanted to meet. Chapter 23. Augustine strode along the street with a cup of coffee in his hand. It had been there in that same left hand for over 30 minutes. He wasn't ready for it yet. His target was around 100 yards ahead on the left. He didn't know if he was too early or too late, but he hoped he was neither. As he reached the house, Augustine was surprised to see one of the people he wanted to speak to exiting what looked like the place he wanted to visit. As Augustine reached the other person, he held out his right hand in offer of a handshake. She reciprocated. As they closed in, Augustine tipped his left hand forward and spilled the entire contents of his coffee cup down her white top. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," he said. "You idiot!" she shouted back. "It's okay, it's not hot, and I can help you get cleaned up. I know someone in the house here. Let's knock and get you cleaned up," Augustine stated, grabbing Joyce under her left arm and escorting her to the door. She was dabbing at the light brown coffee stain on her top, jeans, arm and hands with a single tissue. It was like trying to mop up an oil spill with a single roll of kitchen paper. Augustine knocked at the door. The reply was a firm, "Get lost!" "It's Detective Augustine Boyle. I'd like some help out here, please," he responded, with a firmness in his voice that brought Johnny Lawton to the door within 5 seconds. He still had the golf club in his hand, a 9-iron, if Augustine wasn't mistaken. "Johnny, this is Joyce. Joyce, Johnny. Enough of the introductions. Where's the kitchen? She needs to get cleaned up. Some buffoon has spilled his coffee on her." Johnny looked to the other end of the hall. Augustine took this as the cue to enter and marched Joyce straight past Johnny and into the kitchen. "Towels!" Augustine barked. Johnny returned with 3 clean towels after a quick run up and down the stairs. "Thank you. Now, can you give the lady a little privacy?" Augustine ordered. Johnny backed away and closed the door behind him. He stood in the hallway, wondering what he was witnessing, or what he was now hearing, plus what he'd just witnessed. Was this a coincidence? Were the detective and the blonde working together? Surely not. Joyce turned her back to Augustine and started the process of cleaning herself down. She took off her top and bra, her jewellery, and placed them all on the kitchen work surface. He watched her from behind, not wanting to take his eyes off her, but at the same time not wanting to see her naked. Augustine spotted something on the counter of the kitchen and slipped it in his pocket. He thought it might come in handy, and he wasn't sure if he would ever get this opportunity again. Joyce was wrapped in a towel and turned to Augustine. Johnny had put a t-shirt in with the towels. She turned her back to Augustine again and put the t-shirt on, feeling the roughness that only a lack of fabric conditioner could bring. Definitely a single man's house. "Well, I'll be off then," Augustine said. Before Joyce could turn around, he was past Johnny and on his way to the front door. She followed him, trying without success to get him to turn around. Augustine made his way along the street in the direction he'd arrived from. Joyce took around 30 steps after him before giving up. Whatever had just happened was meant to happen. She couldn't stop that. Joyce got back in her car and looked in her handbag. She smiled at the contents. Back in the kitchen, Johnny couldn't find his car key. "I'm sure I left it on the counter here." He left the house to confront the 2 people who had just entered his house, made a mess and left, but neither was anywhere to be seen. Chapter 24. Augustine sat in the forensics department. He had delivered an item to the head of forensics, Ian Mallon. He was told that it would take up to an hour. Augustine was prepared to wait. It was the last piece of the jigsaw. He looked at the notes that he had brought with him. Augustine picked through the information they had. It made sense now. They had been barking up that many trees that they didn't know which one to climb. Augustine was sure now. The results Ian Mallon would bring through would confirm his suspicions. The name of the limited company that were shareholders in the new golf course development was still a mystery. Lou hadn't managed to come up with anything. As he sat there, Augustine had a brainwave. "Can I borrow a pen?" he asked one of the receptionists in the forensics department. They placed one on the counter. Augustine mumbled a thanks as he picked it up. He scribbled a few things on the paper, crossing letters out and adding new ones. His eyes lit up for the first time in 30 seconds. The second time was when Ian Mallon appeared. "The ring has the blood of Mark McManus on it," Ian Mallon explained. It was the news Augustine had been expecting. Now, to find the culprit and bring them to justice. And I guess it matches the DNA found at the scene. Affirmative, it does. Augustine went back to the office and asked Electra to join him. Where are we going? She asked. To catch a killer. Chapter 25. Electra knocked on the door. It was left ajar. There was no answer. Augustine walked through the front door, Electra behind. As they entered the living room, they could see Daniel Godfrey sat in a chair. Tears were streaming down his face. In his mouth was a gun. He tried to speak, but nothing intelligible came out. Joyce didn't flinch. Joyce, why don't we talk about this? Electra asked. Joyce's right leg twitched. She had been stood there for some time, making her mind up what to do next. It was clear that she had the upper hand over Dan Godfrey, but the rest of the world, she had no idea what was waiting for her outside that front door. What is there to talk about? Joyce asked, the lack of nerves in her voice disguising the way she really felt. Don't kill anyone. Once you murder more than one person, the sentence doesn't just double. You'll be looking at life. What? You think I've killed someone? I'm here doing your job for you. I've caught a killer. Dan has just confessed to me. Haven't you, Dan? Dan shook his head. Haven't you, Dan? Joyce asked again, squeezing the trigger just a little for effect. Dan assented. Let him speak, Electra instructed. Joyce ignored it. Get your cuffs and get this man arrested before he commits another crime. Go on, read his rights. Daniel Godfrey, I'm arresting you, etc., etc. Dan's tears were flowing down his face now. Electra was sure that he would be sobbing if he could catch enough breath to make a sound. She approached Joyce from behind, but this made her twitchy. The trigger was squeezed a little harder. Dan cried some more. Joyce, can you indulge us in a little conversation for a minute or so? Augustine asked. Why would I talk to you? Can't keep your coffee on your hand. Can't keep your eyes to yourself, Joyce replied. What? Electra mouthed to Augustine. He was awful at lip reading, but could manage that. Tell you later, he whispered. Joyce, who would stand to keep all of the money if something happened to Mark McManus and Dan here? Joyce ignored his question. Joyce, Augustine promoted. She threw the gun to the sofa. I can con a stupid prick like Dan with a fake gun, but you guys aren't so fooled. How did you know we knew? Augustine asked. If you really thought I was about to blow his brains out, you were pretty calm about it. There's a few obvious signs, but back to the question. The money would stay in the limited company, Daniel Godfrey responded, his voice trembling with the emotional release of knowing he wouldn't be killed. And who is the next largest shareholder in the limited company, Dan? Well, that's always been a bit of a mystery. It was arranged through an intermediary. The shareholder has always remained anonymous. They're hidden behind a shell company in the Caribbean somewhere. Anonymous no more. The company is called JYC Macrossite. Did you ever wonder what that meant? Augustine asked. Not really. I just thought it was an internet thing. Not quite. It's an anagram of Joyce Mccarty. She would stand to gain control of all that money and all the new development. Now, it's time for you to come quietly, Augustine said. He knew that none of them came quietly, but he could always hope. Joyce picked up the gun and smashed Dan Godfrey over the head with it before leaving via the patio doors. She ran towards the back fence in an attempt to escape. Augustine and Electra were on her before she reached the top. Grabbing a leg each, they hauled her back to the ground. They took her under an arm each and dragged Joyce back to the house via the kitchen door. In the kitchen, Dan was getting to his feet. He looked at the three of them and couldn't decide where his loyalties lay. He looked at each of them in turn. Joyce spotted it first. Dan looked at the knife on the draining board, and then back at the 3 other people present in the room.
"Go on, Dan, give it to them. You take the guy and I'll take the girl," Joyce egged him on. "We can do this together. Together, Dan. You and me. The 2 of us against the world for the rest of our lives. We can do anything with that money, with the freedom it brings. I've already got a route plotted. Venezuela has no extradition treaty with the UK. We'll be safe there. I've got a ticket. We can get you one. We can get you one."
Dan picked up the knife. He passed it from hand to hand like he knew what he was doing. It was something he'd seen in a movie, and it looked like the man was menacing. Dan assumed that the 2 detectives in front of him felt menaced.
"That's it, Dan. You and me. You and me. You and me."
Dan looked at Joyce. He dropped the knife on the floor. He'd had enough of being lied to by her. It was all over. Marked by Murder. Written by S. Thomas Thompson. Narrated by Christian Neal.